which is interesting. And actually, this is what I want to talk about is the kind of discourse and conversation between, kind of more theoretical concepts and more kind of real world understanding of, topics, complicated technology. And so hopefully we can have a conversation with the four of us and maybe a couple of people on Zoom. If they have any questions, everybody should feel free to chime in. I want to talk about sort of thinking like a journalist, as I titled this, but I also want to work through some of the topics that I've written about and how they might be interesting to people at the Institute if they ever listen to this. And I will, and then we can just have a conversation along the way. You guys should, again, feel free to just chime in and ask me questions. So yes, so to get out of the way, sort of my story, I came from, my first job in journalism was actually at a Jewish newspaper called The Forward in New York. And I worked there for about 8 years before I started in New York, before I started covering Wall Street right after the financial crisis for the LA Times initially. And then the New York Times brought me over to write for them. And in the course of writing about finance and markets for the New York Times, I sort of happened upon the story, the early rise of Bitcoin. And it was in this nebulous area between finance and markets and technology, and nobody quite knew what to do with it or whether to take it seriously. And I happened upon it, and I thought I was just going to write a story or two and it would disappear. But I've ended up, really over the last 7 years, focusing increasingly on this sort of bizarre world of cryptocurrencies and blockchains and everything else that's come out of them. The centerpiece of that was this book on the history of Bitcoin called Digital Gold. But I've continued covering it right up till today and the rise of decentralized finance and NFTs and DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations. So it's an odd area that I've ended up covering. It's even odd to me in a way that I've ended up covering it. And I think there's a lot of people who sort of view it as some weird, kind of digital pet rock Bitcoin. But actually the way I ended up here at the Simons Institute was that one of the professor scientists here, Alessandro Chiesa, was one of the inventors of Zcash, which is a privacy-focused cryptocurrency. And he actually initially invited me here to talk to his class about, the rise of Bitcoin and the story and how, scientists might interact with people around this topic. And this paper is this cryptocurrency that's based on ZK snarks, which are becoming increasingly important in the world of cryptocurrencies for privacy. So it's a topic that ranges very high and very low. On the one hand, you've got these like boozy Bitcoin cruises, and on the other hand, you have high-end theoretical computer science that's thinking about these issues. I'm going to start just by talking about, I want to, end up with sort of how I approach problems as a journalist, but I'm going to start actually by talking about the evolution of Bitcoin and the application to some of the areas that the Simons Institute is thinking about, including causality and game theory. I think there is an opportunity. This is an area of research that's probably, it's of increasing interest and concern to academics, but I think there's a lot here to explore. I'll just start by noting that Bitcoin was created in 2009, right after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, in the midst of the financial crisis. And the idea was to create this new kind of electric money that wouldn't have to go through intermediaries like Lehman Brothers, like central banks, that you could just send money from one digital address to another, like you can do with email. So sort of creating a kind of money that would work in the way that email does. And in the first block, the Genesis block of Bitcoin, there was this language from the day, it was actually a few days before it got going, a headline from the Times, Chancellor on the brink of second bailout of banks. And so right there from the beginning was this notion that this was responding to the crisis, the weakness of banks, the way the governments were handling banks at the time. This was digital money in a sense, sort of no different than maybe PayPal money. PayPal dollar is digital. Obviously, all of the dollars in our bank accounts are digital. But in the traditional world, when you digitize money, you need a central intermediary to keep track of the ledger of where all of that money is, whose account it's in. You need somebody keeping track of that because it's digital, it's not physical. And so Bitcoin was an effort to create a system that would make it possible to send money directly without needing that. And that's obviously where cryptography comes in. The basis of these addresses is public key, private key cryptography. That's what makes it possible to have an address, to log into that address, to get access to that address and the Bitcoins in it, without any third party needing to know your password or where your money is. That is the idea. This is actually a shot from yesterday of the Bitcoin blockchain as transactions are coming in. It's a hash of each transaction. The two addresses are not here, but if you hit that hash, you would get the two addresses. So here $110 was being sent, 95,000, 18, 260,000 in one transaction. And these are the transactions that are being broadcast across the network. I think you probably have all heard of the blockchain. The blockchain is just where every transaction is recorded. Beyond this idea of two addresses that can talk to each other, you can email money as you could email, you can send money like you could send an email. The other piece of this is that you have a public ledger on which every transaction is recorded. And this idea of the blockchain, a public ledger of every transaction, is, I would think, for this Center for Machine Learning, an incredible opportunity. You can see every transaction that happens as it happens, where it was sent, the kinds of fees that were involved. This is, I think for sort of machine learning, for data scientists, this is a pretty unusual sort of opportunity and source, because most banks are not going to just give you all of their records of their financial transactions. Here you have an endless ledger that tells you every transaction that's happened back to day one. I'll just take you here to the notion that the people keeping these records, instead of having a central institution, you have, instead of having a central institution that keeps track of every Bitcoin, you have a bunch of nodes across the world that anybody can join. And these nodes are incentivized to join the network and help keep track of transactions by being given new Bitcoin. So every 10 minutes, a block of new Bitcoins is given to a Bitcoin miner, as they're known, somewhere around the world. And these Bitcoin miners are basically keeping track of that ledger that we were looking at. And in return, they are given right now, I think we're at either 12.5 or 7.5 Bitcoins every 10 minutes. And the number of computers, the amount of computing power is what secures the network. And so you're incentivized to join the network. This also provides a way to distribute new coins. So this is how every Bitcoin has ever been distributed. It's to miners on the network. This particular one is set of mining computers is in Russia, which is particularly interesting when it comes to cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin today, because Russia is obviously thinking and talking about Bitcoin as a way around American sanctions, the notion that they might get cut off from SWIFT and not be able to send dollars. The nature of Bitcoin is that they will likely continue to be able to send Bitcoins across the network. So this notion of miners keeping track of this ledger and every transaction happened, as I mentioned, is I think this incredible source of information that has only sort of started to be mined by scientists to understand. There are the main companies that do this right now, do it to help the government basically track down criminals who are using Bitcoin, track down Russian oligarchs who are using Bitcoin, in evasion of US sanctions. And a bunch of these, there are a bunch of these companies that have become very valuable. Chainalysis is the one that I've actually dealt with and used the most. They're very helpful at sort of working through the geography of payments and cryptocurrency networks. But again, it's sort of a nascent area of research that I think offers a lot to computer scientists. So I, though, am coming at this more from the perspective of the human stories. And I think, how did Bitcoin come to be? There's one piece of it, which is the technology, the blockchain, public key, private key cryptography. There's a lot there for computer scientists. One of the interesting things as I've talked to computer scientists over time is how the human tail of Bitcoin kind of diverges at points from what you might expect given the incentives of the network. And actually, I think this is where game theory comes into play. And I think there's a lot of interesting game theory around the incentives set up in these networks. Come on in. So I have been focused on the sort of my book about Bitcoin was about the story, the culture of how it developed and how this emerged. And again, to understand that, part of it is understanding the technology, but another part of it is understanding the people involved. I think for the first 2 years, one of the most interesting parts of the Bitcoin story is the first 2 years when Bitcoin were essentially worth nothing. And there were some computers hooked into the network mining Bitcoin. And they every 10 minutes, they would get 50 Bitcoins delivered to them because they were helping keep that record of transactions. At points, there were 5 or 10 computers. And if they had all turned off their computers, the recording of the transactions would have stopped, Bitcoin would have stopped. And the biggest source of computing power in those first 2 years was from the creator of Bitcoin, who's known as Satoshi Nakamoto. It's this sort of ongoing mystery. We still don't know who Satoshi Nakamoto is. There have been lots of guesses, and I have my sort of best guess as to who it might be. But Satoshi's computers kept it going. And Satoshi mined something like 1 million Bitcoin. There will ever be 21 million. We're now up to, I think, 18.9 million Bitcoins that have been mined. Satoshi's addresses have about 1 million of them. They've never moved. They're worth billions of dollars. What's $1 million times 40,000? 1 million Bitcoins times $40,000 is approximately the value of Satoshi's Bitcoins. They're sitting there in his addresses, and people kind of monitor them to see if those Bitcoins ever move. But during those first 2 years, pretty much Satoshi trying to think of a way to make this idea popular. And he didn't get too much support, but there were a few people around the world who kind of chimed in and took an interest. This kid named Marty Malmi, who lived in Finland, was sort of struggling through college, and was one of the few people to take an interest. He was one of the few libertarians in Finland, and that's not a particularly like socially useful position to have in Finland. So he had to spend a lot of time alone, and he helped Satoshi kind of draw up the first FAQs on Bitcoin and the first website and the first logo, and was also mining Bitcoin at that time. And if it had not been for Marty, Satoshi may well have just sort of shut off the network and stopped the whole thing from moving forward. That was sort of the first 2 years of Bitcoin. At some point, people started trading them, paying 10 cents for them, 20 cents for them. But really, the first time it took off was the Silk Road, which was this online black market for drugs, which was created by somebody who went by the name Dread Pirate Roberts. And this was actually, a lot of people within the Bitcoin realm try to downplay these origins. They want to focus on the sort of socially useful applications of Bitcoin. But the reality is that Bitcoin was useful for sending money without an intermediary. And obviously, the people who are most interested in sending money without an intermediary are not people doing legal transactions. Credit cards tend to work for that, but buying drugs from across the world is not as easy. And so this actually provided a first use case, and it proved that Silk Road proved that Bitcoin worked. You really could send value across the world, and people could send you your drugs in return. And that went on for 2-3 years before the police found Ross Ulbricht, who was the Dread Pirate Roberts, and shut it down. Unsurprisingly, soon after shutting it down, all of the Silk Road's competitors sprung up, and there are now more online black markets using Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies than ever. So this is still a kind of central application of Bitcoin, but certainly not the only one. It's in terms of overall transactions, it's maybe 1% of overall transactions, but in terms of sort of real world economic transactions, illegal transactions are pretty significant. So the next point at which, that was 2011, that Ross Ulbricht created the Silk Road. The next point it really took off was in early 2013. That was the first time the world kind of found out about it. It shot up to something like $100. People attributed it at the time to Cyprus. Cyprus's banks were getting, there was basically a run on Cypriot banks, actually a lot of Russian money involved. But that was actually the kind of given explanation. At the same time that this was happening in Cyprus, and people were thinking, oh, banks are troubled. Maybe these people in Cyprus will use Bitcoin. Maybe this has some value. There was also a conference of venture capitalists in Allen and Co. in Sun Valley, where one of the main sort of Pied Pipers of Bitcoin sold this to venture capitalists, and they all went to their hotel rooms and bought millions of dollars of Bitcoin. And it's actually always been a question, looking back at that moment, was it Cyprus or was it these kind of venture capitalists acting more quietly? When I kind of hear the sort of thinking around causality and how do you establish cause, this is one of these questions where you can dig into the data and try to start to figure that out. And it's a question I think that's still open to me. And there are a lot of points like that in Bitcoin where you have this public ledger that might answer these questions. Obviously, where we are now, things have moved far beyond Bitcoin. We've moved to Ethereum, which is a system where not only can you send money between addresses, but you can establish smart contracts between addresses and encode them into the blockchain so that you can have more complicated programmable money. And that has given rise to decentralized finance, and there are exchanges where you can trade Ethereum and other tokens or Bitcoin for each other without needing a stock, not needing a central organization like Coinbase or the New York Stock Exchange in the case of stocks. This has given rise to this is one of these decentralized exchanges, Uniswap, where you can trade back and forth. This has given rise also to this new world of non-fungible tokens, which is these sort of art tokens that are traded. This is, again, one of these things where you see a lot of sort of mockery of this, but it also, the NFTs, and we can talk more about this if anybody's interested, but sort of point the way towards owning your identity, owning digital assets online, owning digital assets in a way that hasn't been possible till now. Traditionally, if you own, say, a character in a video game, you rely on Electronic Arts or Minecraft to sort of store that character for you. And if they want to deny you access to your account, they're allowed to do that. And NFTs have sort of pointed forward towards a point where you can own digital goods, your identity, your Facebook identity, your Twitter account, without relying on a company. And after Twitter got in a position where they had to basically delete the account of the president of the United States, it's easy to imagine sort of future technology in which people own their social media accounts in a way that a Twitter wouldn't be able to delete them. And that's where sort of blockchain technology and thinking about this, I think, is heading these days. So that's a little bit on the Bitcoin story. I'm going to sort of jump here. I think that sort of introduces some of the way that I have thought about this story as a journalist. I've thought about it through human stories, but also through the data. But I also want to talk sort of a little bit more broadly about journalism, about how journalists think about things and how they interact with scientists and vice versa. So I have been, for most of the last decade, a reporter at the New York Times, which I'm sure you all know all the news that's fit to print at the top, which is one way of stating the mission of the Times. And journalism, I think it's actually not a particularly good way. This does not at all define what ends up in the newspaper every day. It's far from it. And I think it's useful to just sort of review what ends up, what makes a story, because I think it's useful for thinking about, if you want to get your own story, if you want to get your own research out there, it's useful to understand sort of how the news works. Also, understanding that is useful as a public citizen, obviously. So I think for most people, there's this sense that that the Times covers the events of the day and just whatever the latest thing to happen. And in the broadest sense, that's right now, obviously, they're covering Ukraine and they cover the presidential election and all these things, but that's probably, 10, 20% of the paper. And, when it comes to things like coverage of science and academia, it's not just the newest development or what happened this week. It occasionally is. Occasionally there's some, controversy that the Times covers. But, so much of what is in the Times is not the latest development or not the most important thing in a field. It is the sort of nature of the New York Times is covering, and the New York Times has been drawn to cover, because of their commercial model, essentially what is the most unexpected development in any given field that, in relation to what people already know about that field. And so, I actually, my first job right out of college was in Germany. And, there's a sort of joke among journalists that, in each country, there's like this limited number of stories that you can write about. In Germany, if you're writing for an American newspaper, you can basically write stories about Jews, Nazi, Hitler, and the Angela Merkel, the Prime Minister, all of that sort of falls down the list. These are the things that American newspapers are going to be interested in. Japan, we write about sort of technology and old people. And those are the only stories that people think of when they think of Japan. And so those are the topics that the Times is going to cover heavily. After Fukushima, we would write about nuclear reactors and Japan and maybe World War II. But there's a very limited number of topics, and it tends to be, what do people already know about this topic? And then what's the sort of unexpected twist on that? And that formula of sort of what is the unexpected twist on something that people already know about this topic is sort of the explanation for about 50-60% of the stories that go in the New York Times, including most of the ones that get the most read. And at the center of that is this idea that there needs to be tension in the story. Every good story needs something that people would not expect or anticipate. And I'll just cut back to when I was working at the Forward, this Jewish newspaper. One of my sort of big stories that got a lot of attention was one about a kosher meat plant that had these terrible working conditions. They exploited immigrants and paid them. They used underage workers, and there was sexual exploitation. The reality is, if it had been a normal kosher meat plant, I think this story, nobody would have paid attention. Everybody sort of thinks kosher meat plants are probably pretty ugly places to work, and people get injured, and there are a lot of immigrants. And that story would not have been terribly interesting. It was the idea that this was a kosher meat plant that was supposedly responding to some sort of higher ethic that made this story interesting, because it was unexpected. There was this tension between what you think kosher meat was supposed to be and what was happening at this place. And this is the sort of classic nut graph that you see, that you'll find in any article anywhere, which is, here's the first sentence is, here's what you would expect. It is, agri-processors, here's what you know already. It's kosher, so it costs more, and it's held to a supposedly higher standard. But here's the tension, despite those higher standards, this place has, just as bad standard or even worse standards than traditional kosher or traditional meat plants. And so that idea of tension is going to be there in almost every story. And in terms of talking to journalists and selling journalists on stories, that is, people often come to journalists and say, hey, here's the newest thing that's happening. And every journalist's eyes will glaze over. They're always looking for that. But, here's what I expected. And here's what you're going to, here's how you're going to, here's how you're going to surprise me. Tell me something unexpected. So I think that's an important idea to understand, that a lot of people don't necessarily get coming in with journalism. And that is that, when dealing with journalism, when reading journalism, this is, I think, a really useful idea to have in mind. But I also just want to talk a little bit about how the industry and the expectations for the news industry are changing. This may have gotten put in the wrong place. This was, we can talk more about the Winklevoss twins and Bitcoin if you want, but this was a piece of the sort of human story. And I think actually, aside from the sort of unexpected tension, the other stories that do well are people stories, people and here's what they're doing differently than you'd expect. Obviously, with the Winklevoss twins, people knew them from The Social Network, and they had established a reputation with Mark Zuckerberg and for Facebook. And then they came out and said, you know what, we're pivoting, we're going all in on Bitcoin. This was actually the first story I wrote about Bitcoin, and ended up being the most read story for weeks afterwards. But this combination of celebrity and unexpected twists is, one of these formulas that newspapers use. I think, though, that it's worth also sort of talking about how the incentives for the newspaper industry have changed in a way that changes what is the news that we get today. You've probably all heard that the news industry was decimated over, that 2005 to 2013 period. Google and Facebook came online. It first actually began with, Craigslist. They killed the classified page, which was this great source of income for newspapers. Then Google and Facebook come along, eat up the online advertising market, and newspapers. Nobody wants to read physical newspapers, and nobody's willing to pay much for digital ads. So you saw this very precipitous decline for a decade, where most newspapers shrunk by 50% if they weren't destroyed completely. And this has sort of irrevocably changed the news industry and the way news is presented and what is a story these days. The response to this downward slope is that newspapers moved to, instead of relying on home subscriptions and advertising, with home subscriptions and the print paper, the way they made most of their money was advertising. They answered to advertisers. As everything went online, they realized the only way we can make money is to move to digital subscriptions. And so now the Times is making money and is answerable to its subscribers instead of to the advertisers. And this would seem like a great thing. I think there was a lot of criticism that newspapers had to answer to advertisers in the old model, because advertisers could, corrupt the process. They could have a voice. If you print this negative story about us, we're not going to place an ad in the paper anymore. Now we've moved to a system where it is the subscribers that the Times relies on, and the Times needs to hold on to its subscribers and grow its subscribers if it wants to survive. And the thing that this new model, instead of the subscription model that it now relies on, instead of the old advertising model, do you want to, Chip?
Isn't it though sort of, at the beginning of the last century, yellow journalism, it was all subscribers. And then advertising sort of evolved and it became advertisers. And now it's kind of come full circle in some ways, it seems to me.
I mean, certainly advertising was also, a part of yellow journalism, but you're right. This is not an entirely new phenomenon. It's just a change from the sort of allegedly sort of golden era of journalism from, post World War II journalism, where newspapers became these sort of vaunted institutions that were relied upon, and that's the role that the New York Times came to play, and that's when the New York Times came to occupy this. And now the incentives have entirely changed and have moved to subscribers. And so now, again, this would seem like a sort of socially good turn, perhaps, that people, that it is the readers that newspapers need to answer to. But what I think we've learned over the last 10 years of digital subscriptions and newspapers is that people are only willing to pay for a few things in journalism. And one of them is things they need for work. And so that has led to the rise of sort of industry publications and, Bloomberg, Business Week, Stat News is the online for science and biomedicine. And you have now these well-funded publications that work in some niche where it is useful to the jobs that people do, and that they can get reimbursed when they get that subscription. So that's one sort of journalism that's done well here. The other category that has done well, it turns out people are willing to pay for stories that move them and sort of affirm their identities and make them feel good about who they are, or that make them feel angry at who they don't like or who they are not. It can help define their enemies. And this is increasingly become the role that the New York Times has played. People, the subscribers, the stories that people want to read in the New York Times are often stories that either are human stories that can touch you and make you feel like you're connecting with somebody, or stories that can make you feel anger and outrage. You can see from this this list of the 9 most read stories from last year. Most of these are more on the outrage side than they are on the life affirming. Mike Pence reached his limit, Alex Baldwin's gun, the racist Oakland Raiders emails, the Proud Boys mocking Trump. This is outrage shakes Facebook, like this vaunted institution. Yeah, here I can cut in the middle of this. Yeah.
No, so I mean, what do you think about your Ungar Sasson's kind of thesis around this sort of stuff? That in her book, where she talks about, a lot of this journalism is also targeted towards elites because they're the only ones who can afford to pay or are going to go subscribe, and it sort of becomes this ever sort of self-reinforcing bubble of.
Yes. Yeah. I mean that. Yes.
Yes, maybe I missed it, but when you say most read, is it that people just open it and stay on the page like 10 seconds and it counts as read, sorry, or it is that they really read it deeply up to the end, this article?
Yeah, well, this is the stories that were the most clicked on last year.
Okay.
So there are similar lists of the stories people spent the most time with. And those tend to be, and some of the most sort of defining stories for the paper are these long narratives, these long tales, sometimes long investigations. I mean, the Times is so proud of its investigative press. None of these most read stories are investigative stories that dig into stuff. They're things that sort of affirm people's identities. Now, the investigations can still have social impact, even if they are not the most read. So this is not, the Times is still very much committed to doing that, but the incentives have changed, and you can see it in the stories that people read, and the stories that people read are the ones that editors inevitably want more of. I should say that part of what's happened here, as I just indicated, that what people are willing to pay for has created this split in the journalism industry, where you have on one side a handful of these national papers that have the resources to write these either long human stories. This is where obviously podcasts fit in, things like Serial. That's obviously been a big money earner. The New York Times has increasingly moved to relying on podcasts and audio. Audio makes you feel, and so you will connect with that, and you will be willing to pay for that. But the Times, when it comes to sort of that, funds all of the political journalism, all of the investigative stuff. And there's really only a few publications that have managed to capitalize on that. There are really 3 or 4 national publications, the Wall Street Journal, potentially the Atlantic, the Washington Post. And then at the other side, you have the sort of rise of industry publications, Wall Street publications like Bloomberg. Wall Street Journal is in some ways an example of that, Stat News. And then in the middle, everything has just been hollowed out. And that's where local newspapers sit. Local newspapers have continued to decline. I think for the sake of scientists, part of why this is useful to know is that the New York Times has a sort of waning or at least limited appetite for science news. And if I were trying to get interest in my research, if I wanted to get that out there, you're likely to come across much more knowledgeable reporters, people who are well funded. These publications, Ars Technica. I mean, there's no, the sort of tech world now has a whole universe of publications that are inevitably or almost definitely going to write more interesting stuff about your research and spend more time, if anybody is, than is the New York Times. And I think that's sort of useful to know for journalists. I think niche specialty publications have become more important in the sort of understanding of specific topics than national news organizations have. And that's useful to know. I think the sort of latest development, and I actually should say before I move on to that, from that discussion of sort of the incentives in the news industry, probably this is no surprise, but I think the sort of academic industry, such as it is, has similarly responded to the incentives in some of the same troubling way, or in ways that are perhaps equally troubling to what has happened to newspapers. Obviously, I'm not, telling you any surprise when I say that, the academia has become focused on publications and tenure, and not on teaching, not on sort of influencing the public discourse. And I think that's meant that there has been a divide between, on the one hand, the public discourse, and on the other hand, knowledge coming out of academia. It's why, the idea of bringing journalists into universities, I think, is a good idea to sort of get them understanding some of the work that's going on here. But I think there's this chasm that separates the two that may actually be on display today in the lack of an audience here. And I think it's a telling chasm. I mean, there are some places that are more focused on sort of cutting edge theoretical stuff that the public is never going to understand. And that is necessary and useful. And there's no, but I think there could be more of a conversation. I think, academia has sort of walled itself off in the same way that that the journalism industry has sort of responded to these populist incentives that they have. And I think I've certainly noticed in sort of spending time here, coming back to campus after a while, the degree to which scientific jargon and sort of the incentives of publications make it often very hard to understand what is happening in the academic world for anybody outside of it. And this is in areas computer science where obviously this is important. This is defining the future. This sort of optimizing machine learning and these are all like ideas that are going to have important implications for society. So there should be more bridges built. And I just want to mention one last thing before I open it up, if we can have some conversation around any of this. I do think the latest development in the sort of evolution of journalism is this idea, sort of strange and not all that apparently compelling idea, but has actually been quite important, which is the rise of newsletters like Substack. Twitter now has its version Review, Ghost, Facebook has its version. I think at first everybody was like, "Why?" I mean, these are just emails. Why would anybody care? But it turns out that all of the best, not all of, many of the best journalists have realized they can actually make more money going off and starting their own newsletter and having their own voice than they can, getting paid a salary by the Times. Their value is greater than what the Times offers them. And I think it's allowed journalists to, my perspective on this, I've become a big fan of a lot of Substack newsletters. There's a lot of issues with them, which people are writing about these days, but they offer journalists an opportunity to be honest and to speak without the kind of cliches and jargon and sort of restrictions of newspapers, which have these very narrow ideas of what are stories and how stories should be written. So I think this is important, and it's also important because it's allowed academics to actually have a platform, those who want them. So you see some of the best-selling, most popular Substack subscriptions are actually professors who realize that there is an audience that wants to learn about these topics, and it gives them total freedom to express that, to experiment. And I think this isn't going to support the whole journalism industry, but I think it's a sort of promising development, particularly when it comes to writing about niche topics. And I think that people who can find a way to communicate complicated topics to a broad public now sort of have that outlet without needing to get through the editors at the New York Times. So I am going to stop there and see if anybody has any questions, if we can talk about any of the wide variety of topics that I brought up. But first of all, thank you all for coming, and yeah, I'm happy to answer anything.
Are we using the mic? It's recorded and full price. Forgot that.
Thank you, Nathaniel. My name is Steve Tadelis. I'm an economist here at Berkeley. And I have two questions. One kind of shorter, one that kind of has more meat behind it. The shorter one is, as an economist, I'm not a computer scientist. I know enough about crypto to kind of have an idea, but I don't really understand the nitty-gritty. As a journalist who covers science, technology, how deep do you go, right? At what point do you feel like I know enough to convey this to readers, and I don't know enough to really fully understand it? So that's my first question. The second one is related to what you just ended with. When I think of New York Times, Washington Post, other major respected newspapers, I think of them as gatekeepers of quality. Right? I rely on them to screen the journalists. So when someone reports for the New York Times, I'm like, okay, I trust this, not because I know who Nathaniel or John or Jane is, but because it's New York Times. When things get disaggregated, like, who the fuck is this person? Why should I trust them? Where's the quality control? And I'm wondering if this is a very slippery slope. So curious your thoughts on both questions.
Yeah, in some ways, I think the second one is almost is it easier to answer? Or I mean, I think the issue with the New York Times and the issues I'm trying to bring up here are sort of pointing out the current incentives for the New York Times and the types of stories they write. Clearly, like getting the facts right is still important. They every time they have a scandal where some of their facts are not right, it does incredible damage to their brand and their business. But we've seen many times, I think, over the last few years, where they will defend things that actually aren't right because and which stories that they wrote because they were responding to these incentives. They wanted to present the story that would make you feel the most and get the most angry and respond the most, and the headline that would evoke that. And I think that as long as you're aware that those incentives are there, yes, they need to get it right. And I think that's they do have an infrastructure set up to do that in a way that not very many other places have. I don't think that Substack can replace that. Really, what Substack can do is provide a place for people who have risen out of that and established a reputation as reliable. And I mean, the people I read are not people who just came at it from nowhere. They're people who have worked in these fields and maybe not really had an outlet before to reach the public. I mean, one of my favorite ones is a geneticist who writes about, human evolution and in quite technical terms. And if he were doing this as a column for the New York Times, the nuance would get stripped out of it. And because it's on Substack, he has the freedom to do that and actually develop a very large audience for it. Now, he is not going to get the kind of editing and proofreading that the New York Times would have, but in some ways he has more feedback from his readers and is more responsive to his readers because he's emailing them and they write back to him immediately. And, there's this thing that can happen at the New York Times where, you write your story, you wrote most of it, but your editor put stuff in and you have to defend it. Because it's the paper that's going to decide if they want to change something. And you might think, you know what, that is wrong. That's not the best way of saying it, but that would involve a correction. And so it doesn't get made. And so, that's what goes into down for posterity. A newsletter writer, often the very next newsletter will be a conversation about, people didn't like this line. Let's talk about why that's true. That doesn't happen in the New York Times. And so you can have a more, I think, evolving conversation. I mean, this is what, the early blogosphere, I think, also offered and why it was so valuable that, disappeared. This is kind of a return of that. But, this does not replace newspapers. It does not, it does not fill many of the roles. I think for things like investigative journalism, you need kind of institutions and different areas of expertise. But I think, when I want to read about the latest survey, the latest public polling, I would much rather read, Nate Silver sort of go back and forth or read him debate somebody on Twitter than read a New York Times story that kind of presents one view and leaves out there's real disagreement about, this polling method or that Iowa thing really screwed up everything. And I'll get more of that from reading that conversation than I will from reading a New York Times story about it. But it requires a lot more investment, obviously. And so you do get these sort of specialized, it's a much more specialized world in which that information doesn't necessarily sort of percolate up to the general public. So, and then on the Bitcoin front, I'll just say, I am not a computer scientist. Over covering Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies for 6-7 years, there have been a lot of points at which I realized, I don't really understand this, or I have to stop here. A lot of those points have been points that I then, okay, I want to understand, the most basic public-private key cryptography. I mean, I think I get how that works. You at each point, you're writing a story and you realize, oh, there's this technical thing that actually matters. And now it's time that, you understand that. And usually, if there is one technical issue you need to understand because it stands in the middle of this, you can get there. You can, so that happens constantly, but it's often those things you don't, once they become important enough to understand, I think, even the most complicated topics, I think there's a way to often eventually get there if you need to. And that's one of the benefits of this rise of specialty publications, is that you have people with that expertise now, because you don't, the New York Times was famous, every 3 years you'd get a new beat, and you were a science reporter, and then you were in Berlin, and then you were in Japan, and you didn't really know and I think we're moving towards a more specialized world in which people are more likely to actually know the topics they're writing about, at least for a lot of these specialized publications. So there was somebody else had their hand up. Either of these odd topics.
So I'm just curious, in doing digital gold and all of your varied research, besides dark money use and maybe moving money from rogue countries, have you found a lot of useful applications? I mean, there's all these companies, all this venture capital, all this money going into exchanges and security and lending. and prices keep going up, but I still sometimes sit there and go,
What's it all for?
like, to what, I mean, there's lots of people driving Lamborghinis that
Yeah.
I'm not, but in some, like, really, you know, in the essence of it,
What's the Lamborghini industry is an important one for, you know, the Italian economy. So it's a good question. It's one I have asked all along. You know, what is this good for? So I think the most basic answer that, you know, Bitcoiners will give you is that for Americans, there isn't that much use for this. It doesn't do much that you can't already do with digital money. For somebody in Argentina or China or Russia right now, I mean, you know, Russia puts it in a different light, but there are a lot of places where the government can come in and take your bank account, or the local currency can be inflated away to a point where your bank account disappears. And for somebody there, digital money that the government can't seize plays a more useful function. And it's very hard to know how many people are using it for that, because we can see that a lot of people, for instance, in China have bought Bitcoin. You know, China eventually tried to ban it. They kicked all of the miners out of the country. So, but certainly part of the reason it was popular in China was because people were afraid of an authoritarian government and wanted to have money in a way that could move. Now, is that because they're evading taxes or because they're human rights lawyers who are afraid of, I mean, probably more evading taxes than, you know, trying to get to Macau to gamble than there is, you know, artists or human rights people needing to have their funds safe. But, you know, that's there. I think over the last 2 years, what you've seen, and this is less with Bitcoin and more with Ethereum and the competitors to Ethereum, is a whole bunch of applications that still are not widely used, but that do point the way towards a different financial system, B, a different form of sort of keeping track of our digital identity. I mean, right now we rely on Facebook, or people who use Facebook rely on Facebook to manage their social identity. People on Twitter, I mean, I have a Twitter account with 50,000 followers. Tomorrow, Twitter can just delete that. And I don't know who any of those 50, I mean, I know who some of those 50,000 followers were, but I don't get that back. My whole history of what I've written there basically belongs to Twitter, and they can delete it tomorrow. If I had an account that I owned, I could, you know, if Twitter makes me mad or Twitter does something irresponsible, I could move my identity over to another system. That's, you know, owning your digital identity and your sort of digital goods is what this points towards, and things are starting to emerge with that. I mean, I pointed towards non-fungible tokens. Right now, it seems like the most frivolous thing, people are trading, you know, these images, art. Sometimes they're buying one-of-one art. Do they actually own the art? It's unclear, but they own something that is sort of, they own this token that can give them access to things, give them access to communities. And you start, when you sort of play around with it, you start to understand how this might become something that's more useful. And you're getting those kind of applications. And that, you know, Facebook has obviously bet its future on the metaverse. And so if we all live in the metaverse or some version of it or spend time in it, you know, the question is, do we want Facebook to own that? Or do we maybe want to live, you know, to the degree where any of us are going to be in a metaverse, do we want to live somewhere where we're in charge, we own our identity, we own whatever expression we make there. So this is all, I think, where this potentially becomes useful. You're already seeing, you know, financial transactions done without exchanges. There's a reason that, you know, Wall Street and financial industry is afraid of this and trying to get involved, because it is already cutting them out to some degree. And that's happening. Even when you talk about trading of financial assets. Now, it is the current, what we have in cryptocurrency is it any better than the New York Stock Exchange? You can certainly argue, but it's creating a potentially new paradigm. So it's not, I think, it doesn't just end with Lamborghinis.
So coming back to your incentive story, I was wondering about polarization, right? So we now seem to think mostly of social media as drivers of polarization because they also have this kind of incentive to enrage people and make them angry. So what you're showing here seems to suggest that even classical newspapers are also contributing to polarization. Is that true? Do you think it is that the case?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the New York Times needs to answer to its readers, its subscribers. You know, the New York Times, I think, likes to argue that it is not a sort of liberal, progressive newspaper, but, there have been plenty of studies done. I mean, the readership is largely progressive and does want a paper that affirms those politics and that sort of identity. And if you look through the stories, that's often quite clear. And it affirms sort of the worst thing you think about the other side. You're not, there's a sort of a famous story where the New York Times wrote a sort of slightly sympathetic story trying to understand the sort of an alt-right figure in Ohio. And it was just like, how could you ever write about this person and give him a platform? And, I would argue that the Times should have written more about the alt-right before the rise of Donald Trump and help people understand, why are people being drawn to that? It's harder for the New York Times to do that now with its subscribers, with its reliance on subscribers. So I think that's a real issue.
Thank you all. Let's thank
3 o'clock.
Nathaniel for an insightful talk.
Yes, thank you guys for being here.